sa Confidential and Intelligence Funds or CIF ng Office of the President or OP.
Angara noted, though, that Congress should be provided reports on how these funds were used.
Our President, Your Honor, because he's responsible. I mean, even things which are not his fault are blamed on him. So I think he deserves to know what's happening.
Aside from the offices of the President and Vice President, other government agencies are asking for confidential and intelligence funds in their 2023 budgets. A senator says this will set a dangerous precedent. We discussed this issue tonight on The Chiefs. Of News 5, and joining us tonight is One News business editor Regina Lay, LCV. Reg,
hello.
Welcome. Good evening.
Hi, Roby. Hi, Reg.
Good evening. Hi, Robbie. Hi, LCV.
Anong balita, LCV?
Well, at last, the DOJ has set preliminary probe into the case versus Bantag. Diba? Tsaka nagsapina na. So, inaabangan natin nga, pero parang hindi nagsustand down si Gerald Bantag. You know, diba? Palaban pa rin eh.
No. Pero habang nagsusumbatan sila, kung ano-ano ang literally nabubungkal. Di ba? Dati naisama na yung mga
kubol naman ngayon, di ba?
mga kubol, mga bangkay.
Batuhan lang talaga ng mga, ano ba tawag dyan, bintang talaga ng kung ano-ano eh.
And among other things, Reg, they're saying, some people are speculating about that, I don't know what you call it, that hole, that ditch being dug at in Muntinlupa.
Yung rescue tunnel or escape tunnel na, hindi mo nga malaman, ano ba yun, nagkakwari daw sila ron dahil may gold daw. Kung ano na ng cheese. Kumalabas to eh. Grabe.
Well,
talaga tong bilibid, ano? It's a whole new world.
Well, para to be sure, Reg, we did ask about that gold, para lang no stone unturned, so to speak. But we asked Mahar Lagmay, Professor Lagmay of the National Institute of Geology, and asked him, ano ba yung alam natin? What do we know about the geology in Muntinlupa? And sabi niya, well, as far as we know, basically, adobe lang yung mahahanap po siya. So sabi
may hidden treasure daw kung talaga.
Hindi. Actually, yun ang tanong niya, di ba?
Actually, yung hidden treasure na yan.
Nasa morgue. 120 of them.
Actually,
isa pa yun.
Actually,
It's nakakatawa. It's parang away bata no? I mean, this word war between Bantag and SOJ, Secretary Remulla.
The difference, of course, on the part of SOJ Remulla and the Department of Justice, meron silang tinutungtungan, di ba, na mga testimonies, and then yung kay Bantag is all, well, we really have to see. But right now, he's just throwing in a lot of things. And so far, wala namang basis yung mga pinagsabi niya. But like you said, all of this is leading to a lot of speculation, Filipinos being Filipinos. Some love the word war, but we're trying to keep focus on everything developing on that front. In the meantime, we will be speaking to our first guest. We'll be talking about the budget, but also President Marcos' trip to Cambodia to join the ASEAN summit. We'll be getting to all of that after a short break. Our first guest after that break. Keep it here on One News. President Bongbong Marcos is back from the ASEAN summit. There, he raised the urgency for developing a code of conduct over the South China Sea. He says to head off any potential conflicts. But the president walked away empty-handed to dissect everything that developed or did not develop. We're speaking with De La Salle University International Studies Professor Renato De Castro. Good evening, sir. Welcome back to the Chief.
Hello, good evening. How are you doing?
Nice naman po, sir.
evening, Prof.
Hello.
Buti pa kayo, parang mas maaliwalas dyan sa kinatatayuan nyo.
We will be discussing about the West Philippine Sea.
Yan.
Nasa West Philippine Sea ka ngayon.
Kakaliwanag ba? Is that why your backdrop is looking so sunshiny?
Okay.
So, diretso tayo. Ayun nga, parang, does your background and what you just said, does it suggest, I mean, what's your outlook on you know, let's start with that. The Code of Conduct in the South China Sea, matagal nating narinig ito, pinag-uusapan. May nagde-develop ba? Every time nagsasama ang mga ASEAN leaders, meron bang, may direction ba? Is this headed somewhere positive? Are things in fact developing?
Well, una-una, we have to understand what is the Code of Conduct. Actually, it does not intend to solve the South China Sea or West Philippine Sea dispute. It simply manages. So that's something we would have to emphasize. Every time I hear people say, you know, the solution there is a code of conduct, that is far from the truth. It will simply...
Meron na nga nun di ba, Prof?
Declaration yun.
There was...
The declaration. The declaration.
But there was,
Yeah, the 2003, which states that ASEAN and China wants a binding code of conduct. No, pinag-uusapan dito, of course, is something that will bind ASEAN, legally binding ASEAN and China. Ito yung, of course, the negotiation actually started after we won the case. This was in 2017 when China said, okay, it's time for us to negotiate for the code of conduct. But going back to what I was saying earlier, in August 2019, when President Duterte visited Beijing, President Xi Jinping promised him, by the time you step down in 2022, you know, the code of conduct will be there. Nothing happened. Of course, China has a lot of reasons to say, nagkaroon ng pandemic, China is not yet ready to have a code of conduct. So again, this is a case simply of delaying the negotiation. Okay, we can discuss, of course, what are the reasons behind the delay, the long delay in the code of conduct.
Oh, okay. What do you think will the code of conduct look like, Prof?
Okay.
Can you give us an idea of what that code will basically say? No?
Okay, number one, supposed to be, it would freeze the situation in the South China Sea. No build-up of artificial islands, no movement of military vessels, no operation of the Coast Guard. But of course, China has basically unraveled everything.
Yes.
Ever since, of course, China built those artificial islands and, of course, fortify those islands, militarize those islands. So kung magkakaroon tayo ng code of conduct, then we would have to accept the fact that those
they're already there.
They're already there. And of course, you have the operation of the People's Liberation Army's Navy, the Chinese Coast Guard, and the Chinese militia.
Kasi
so,
medyo...
na tayo kaagad. Force to good na tayo kaagad.
Force to good,
kasi...
So, the Code of Conduct has three very contentious issues, no? Number one, gusto ng ASEAN, it should be binding. Ang sabi ng China, no, it should be voluntary. So, balik ulit tayo doon sa declaration. So China doesn't want to really, at this point in time, ayaw maging binding na China. Pangalawa, yung issue ng geographic scope.
Yes.
Gusto ng Vietnam, no, kasama yung paracels. Ang gusto ng China, spratly lang. So may issue na yon. Ang pangatlo, ang sabi ng China, China should have a say to any military exercises between any ASEAN country and a third party.
Tayo ang mananagot dyan naman, no?
Parang tayo naman. Balikatan. Singapore also has conduct military exercises. And Malaysia, members sila ng 5 power packs. They conduct military exercise with Australia, Britain. So China wants to have a veto regarding those military exercises. No? In a way, China wants to remove what China calls the external power.
Okay.
Japan, the United States, Australia from the equation.
Ay, siguro basic question, Prof, with everything, lalong-lalo na if you throw in something like that, na okay lang, may veto kami sa lahat ng mga military exercises in this particular area, however we define it. But it sounds like parang ayaw nyo naman talaga makipag-usap eh. Diba? I mean, given that 2003 pa yung declaration, everything that's developed since 2003, what actually gives us any confidence or any basis to say that at the very least, China is sincere about this?
From the Chinese perspective, no, they also have a debate. No, unang-una sinasabi ng mga Chinese, amin na to eh. This is a 9-dash line. So why should we allow the ASEAN countries to constrain us with a code of conduct? Anyway, the South China Sea is ours.
Well, kaya nga, I guess the question is, what's in it for China that they would even enter into any discussion to arrive at a code of conduct? What's in it for them?
That's
Why
what
would
they say para to keep away the external powers and the US and Japan. We're having a good time with the ASEAN countries. We're able to manage this dispute because right now we are negotiating for a code of conduct. So there's no need for you to interfere because China and ASEAN could manage the dispute.
No, but if they're going to insist anyway on their 9-dash line, di ba? Eh di para tayong walang pinag-uusapan. Parang kumbaga, kayo pa rin sa inyong pananaw, kayo pa rin ang nagmamay-ari niyan anyway. At para kami nagpapaalam sa inyo kung ano man ang gusto namin gawin dyan. Eh hindi naman tayo discussion among equals, di ba?
No way, no way. China, sabi nga nung I don't know if you remember in July 2010, when then Secretary Hillary Clinton announced in Hanoi that the United States has, of course, vital interest in the South China Sea dispute. Nagalit yung he was a former ambassador to the Philippines and he became, of course, the Counselor for Foreign Policy Affairs ng Communist Party. Yet, I forgot his name. I will not mention it. Baka mamaya. Sabi niya, nagalit siya sa ASEAN countries. China is big, ASEAN countries are small. This is a reality you'll have to accept.
Yeah. Right. Teka lang I just want to get the timeline straight because you brought up the declaration of the Code of Conduct. If I recall correctly, di ba 20 years ago when it was signed?
Yeah, it was signed. It was a
Two
declaration.
decades.
Two
right.
decades.
So it's not we're not talking 2019, a few years ago. We're talking 2 decades na to.
Yeah,
right?
2 decades. No, sabi ang expectation on when we signed the declaration, ASEAN and China would negotiate a code of conduct. That never happened.
Correct.
Until the ruling came out. The ruling came out in 2017, July.
2016, yeah.
July.
2016, yes.
Then China announced in May 2017, it's time for China and ASEAN to talk about the framework. Ang sabi pa ng China noon, framework for a code of conduct.
Right. So the question, Prof, the question to you is, okay, yung foundation of this code of conduct has been 20 years in the making. Do you even personally still hold out hope we could make it happen, a COC?
Well, yes, once of course China completes its militarization of the West Philippine Sea. China, we have basically accepted China's naval presence in our region, and of course China has eventually been able to push out Japan, Australia, and US from the equation. That's the time China would say.
So they basically dictated that timeline.
No? So sasabihin na ng China, we now have to freeze the situation wherein I have all the strategic advantage in the West Philippine Sea. Then we freeze the situation, we have a code of conduct.
Kasi Prof, di ba, essentially what we could have frozen in 2003 looks very, very different from what we will be freezing today. Now, we've been talking about China primarily. Let's talk about ASEAN. Anong assessment mo sa galawan ng ASEAN given the different interests as well within the region?
Well, ASEAN itself is divided. You cannot expect the continental Southeast Asian countries like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar to have an interest in the South China Sea issue. So the South China Sea issue, especially when it comes to the Code of Conduct, is primarily the concern of the 4 maritime Southeast Asian countries, the Philippines,
Vietnam,
Malaysia,
Malaysia.
Vietnam, Brunei, and to a certain degree, Indonesia. Although Indonesia is not a claimant.
Yeah.
Pero Indonesia also has an interest kasi yung North Natuna Sea, it's within the 9-line ng China.
So ilimit lang natin doon sa nabanggit mo. Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, Cambodia.
Brunei.
Brunei, Darussalam.
The maritime.
Okay. Yung mga may maritime interest dito, what kind of a voice could they have and what kind of voice do they actually have at this point?
Well, sinasabi nga ni Associate Justice Carpio, no? At least the claimant states should negotiate among themselves. This was attempted around 2015, but Brunei did not attend. Indonesia, I think Malaysia was here, the Philippines was here, Vietnam. Then Brunei did not send a representative. So wala, nothing happened dun sa efforts to at least galvanize the claimant states.
Okay, so dito rin sa ginawa ni PBBM na ni-raise niya ulit yung Code of Conduct, how urgent it is, no? Pero parang dinedma di ba?
Well, ASEAN accepted it. Ni-raise niya yun sa, of course, pagdating sa China. China will always, yun.
Oo. Do you think that China will feel the pressure this time? Or that it will even give in, knowing that they've at least set up their military installations in the Spratlys anyway? Do you think that they would be more open now?
No, I don't think so.
Wala pa rin.
And China knows for a fact that it has effectively divided ASEAN.
Yeah. But to your point kanina that one of the leverages, or at least that China was looking at, was at least to get all the other stakeholders in freedom of navigation in general out of the way. As you said, at least China got to move Japan out of the way. They got to go. They got to isolate the United States and Australia for that matter. But given that is a key leverage, what is being developed and what can ASEAN and particularly the maritime countries do, and what are we in fact doing? I know we're trying to open up that conversation as well about multilateral international patrols, for example, bringing in the Australians, the United States, and so on. What's developing on that front?
Well, ang position naman ng ASEAN countries is, of course, the more the merrier. We don't want China to be the only customer. Eka nga, no? We don't want China to dominate, to transform Southeast Asia into its backyard. It's the interest of ASEAN to get the other powers involved. Kaya nga tayo may East Asian Summit and, of course, the post-ministerial meeting to impress upon China that, ASEAN welcomes the presence of the other great powers, the United States. And also one thing that was raised by President Marcos just before he left, he basically told the United States, we need your assistance, especially when it comes to maritime security. So, ayun, the best thing that ASEAN could do, of course, is to make sure that China does not dominate the equation. And, of course, we also have to remember, the real solution to the West Philippine Sea dispute is the arbitral ruling.
Yes.
It provides the ultimate solution because it basically declares that the root cause of the dispute, which is China's 9-line, has no legal basis.
Yes,
Well, sa positive side, sa positive side naman, minention ni President Bongbong Marcos along with the Code of Conduct. That the Code of Conduct should also be based on UNCLOS.
But the question remains as to whether China will honor that and will change its ways on account of it. I mean, all of these years, wala naman, di ba? So parang are we really looking at a dead end on, this issue of a code of conduct or anything at all that will give us a little bit of, di ba, the freedom that we have over our claims?
Well, that's a reality we face. We are, China considers Southeast Asia as its backyard. China is a ascendant power. China is conscious of its growing capabilities. So that puts really the ASEAN really on a defensive. But on the other hand now, we have, of course, the U.S.-China strategic rivalry. And the South
And the
China...
Taiwan issue.
And the Taiwan issue yun.
Yes, the one
Probably
China
ang magiging, ang mangyayari, masa-sideline ang West Philippine Sea, South China Sea issue.
Right.
The real flashpoint will be the Taiwan Strait issue.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And mas delikado sa atin yan. Nasa north lang natin. And of course,
Yes. And how true are the reports that the U.S. is now asking for 5 additional military bases in order
it's the
to
Philippine, it's the armed forces of the Philippines that offered that.
Tayo bang humingi nun?
Tayo nag-offer nun.
Ino-offer natin.
Yes.
So, is it a good idea to give in to that? Or doesn't that make us, in effect, parang palaban toward China?
Well, we have to. China is trying to occupy our backyard. Why should we be docile, submissive to China?
But
Unless we
it's
want to
more
continue
about Taiwan than the West Philippine Sea, di ba?
It's also our geostrategic interest. Taiwan is close to us. We don't want Taiwan to be a province of China. You will have Chinese naval power just across the Luzon Straits.
Prof, sorry. I have to stop you there because, look, President Marcos came from that ASEAN summit saying we follow one China policy.
It does. It's different. It's different.
No. He said that very, verbatim, and which means to say that we believe as a country that Taiwan is part of China, and therefore whatever issues between them, they must resolve internally. Yun yung sabi niya.
Yes.
Now,
that's but once you have a conflict there, we will be involved whether we like it or not. Because
so where do we position ourselves, especially when you think about it, the U.S. under President Joe Biden has repeatedly said that the American military stands ready to defend Taiwan if the Chinese military were to launch operations. So where do we position ourselves in that equation?
We are a treaty ally of the United States. We want to invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty when it comes to the West Philippine Sea. The U.S., as our treaty ally, could also invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty. Alliance is a two-way street. We expect assistance from our ally. We are also obliged to provide assistance to our ally.
Except we recognize one China.
No, it's totally different equation in one China. Iba na yan eh. One China policy is a legal situation.
Okay. So
a conflict between Taiwan and China is a geographic nightmare.
Okay.
So we have to separate from the two.
Okay.
Even the United States adopts they have a different one China policy. Remember, there are several one China policies. Hindi yan isa. There's a one China principle which China is selling to the world based on the Shanghai Communique, but there are about 189 one China policies.
Okay.
For example, I'll give you an example. Japan and the US has a different one China policy. They recognize there's one China, but they don't accept the Chinese formula that Taiwan is a province of China. Tayo, we adopt a very legalistic, very rigid one China policy. But other countries, no. So there's no one China policy. There's one China principle that China is selling to the world, but several countries have different versions of their one China policy.
Okay. In the meantime, Prof, we're running out of time. One last question na lang po. Let's talk about President Marcos, his options here for the Philippines. Tama po ba? I mean, binibilang ko, ano ba yung mga barahan na hawak natin? So we have the arbitral ruling. That's a card that we can play or not play, as we saw with President Duterte. You have the prospect, the potentials, the concept of U.S. bases, or at least basing rights in the Philippines. And then, for whatever it's worth, however we interpret our one China policy, ano pa po ba mga baraha ang hawak natin kaya malakas o mahina? And how would you assess how President Marcos is playing these cards, certainly vis-a-vis how President Duterte was playing these cards?
Of course, as a middle power, hindi ko na sinasabi small power tayo, middle power tayo, we can only take advantage of opportunities. Opportunities are generated by the superpower, the great powers. We can only take advantage. Of course, what ASEAN has been using so far is the competition between the United States and China. So we can take advantage of, with the hope that this competition will not become an head-on armed conflict. So ASEAN has been playing remember, ASEAN has always been a player when it comes to great power competition. Starting with the Cold War, nung in-invade ng Vietnam, Cambodia, so forth and so on. So ASEAN is a very good player. We've learned from ASEAN. But of course, ayan yung limitation natin.
But is ASEAN divided in its loyalties? I mean, for example, I would imagine that Cambodia and Vietnam would be on China's side, right?
Vietnam would play a
in the
game.
U.S. versus China, sabihin na natin, not a fight, but in that game, who would be the partners of each giant among the ASEAN nations? I mean, we're definitely, I'm sure, on the U.S. side.
Right? We are a treaty ally. That is something we have to admit. We always look at the United States, just in case magkaroon ng disputes sa West Philippine Sea. You know, the late President Benigno Aquino strengthened our alliance with the United States. EDCA was signed during his term. Unfortunately, of course, this was not implemented by the Duterte administration until the last part of his term. So I was asked a question, ano ba yung difference? President Duterte tried to appease China. And of course, he realized the folly of appeasement. China could not be appeased. China would expand. President Bongbong Marcos is trying to play what I will call a balancing game. You know, strengthen our alliance with the United States, engaging China, but there's always limits to what, you know, we can do. We can only take advantage of opportunities, but we ourselves, as middle powers, could not create those opportunities.
Okay. Professor De Castro, maraming salamat, sir.
Maraming salamat rin. Thank you very much, all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof.
Professor Renato De Castro teaches international studies at the LSU. And we will start up another conversation after the break. Stay with us. The Chiefs will be right back. At least 9.3 billion pesos is going to confidential and intelligence funds under the proposed budget for next year. Our next guest has some concerns. Joining us tonight, former Senator Franklin Drilon. Senator Drilon, welcome once again to the Chiefs.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Thank you very much for having me again.
Papa. Sir, some basics lang muna. We keep saying confidential and intelligence funds. First, ano ba pagkakaiba nun ng confidential and intelligence funds? Are they one and the same? And then also, more generally, what is the legal and political history of confidential and intelligence funds in our republic?
Okay, Ro, it's good that's the first question because we define first what are confidential and intelligence funds. There is a circular 21501 issued on January 8, 2015 by COA, by DBM, by the DILG, the DND, and the GCG. It defines what are confidential expenses, and that is confidential expenses, according to this circular, refer to expenses pertaining to or related to the surveillance activities in civilian government agencies intended to support their mandate or operations. On the other hand, intelligence expenses refer to those related to intelligence information gathering of activities of the uniformed and military personnel and intelligence practitioners. In other words, the basic difference is that the so-called confidential expenses are funds which are dispensed with by civilian agencies, and the intelligence expenses are those for the military. But the accounting is the same for the two funds. They are accounted through what is called as the closed envelope system, meaning you account for your expenses, place it in a sealed envelope, and submit it to the COA, and that you have accounted for your for the public funds assigned to you. We must so there, to a certain extent in
COA does audit it.
sorry.
COA does get to audit those funds.
The COA does get the report of how the public funds were dispersed, but this is not available for public scrutiny by the very nature of its
Okay.
expense. But in my view, Congress can, in the exercise of its functions, inquire into this use of public funds, but it must be done in an executive session, because the rule, Luchi, is that the disbursement or use of public funds must be transparent, because these are funded. It must be transparent. That's the general rule. Now, the exception is when you talk about confidential and intelligence funds. And in this particular case, the burden is on the agency concerned to justify that they need confidential and intelligence funds in order to fulfill their mandate. Okay. And this is where a lot of debate is going on, because I have counted, I think, in the 2023 proposed budget, there are over 30 agencies with confidential and intelligence funds. Over 30, if I recall correctly, about 33 agencies. And therefore, for the sake of transparency, those offices which do not really, which cannot really justify this use of confidential funds, the funds must be accounted for in the ordinary auditing manner. Meaning it must be made public. There is no justification for these funds being
Senator,
through a sealed envelope system.
Senator, pasensya po. Just very quickly to prompt the second part of my question. Ano yung history nito? You mentioned 30 agencies at this point. People were a bit surprised already when we started talking about Office of the President and then Office of the Vice President needing confidential. But if you can bring us back in history, at the start po ba, what did it contemplate? What did it allow? Did it start with just the Office of the President and then lumawak na lang ng lumawak? What was the original design for this?
If you are going to be very strict about it, here I am talking. I'm not talking from on the part basis of the records, but technically, intelligence funds are only for those who are gathering information for security purposes. But over the years, it has developed, and the scope has been widened, and now the confidential expenses, confidential and intelligence funds amounts to over 9 billion pesos.
Yes.
Again, I would emphasize that these are public funds.
Yes. How was it before it became 30 government agencies with confidential and intelligence funds? For example, when you were Senate President, or when you were a senator for that matter, how many government agencies were allotted confidential and intelligence funds? I mean, because the office of the president, we understand that it would have such funds. The OVP now, that's the crux of the debate also, because she being VP and head of DepEd, and even DepEd now has confidential funds. And now you're saying there are actually over 30 government agencies. All we know about are OP, OVP, and Office of the Solicitor General. Who are these? Which other agencies?
Well, you asked me the question, were these funds available to them before? Just
Yes.
an answer, in the present General Appropriations Act, there are three agencies which are given confidential and intelligence funds for the first time. They use the Office of the Vice President, the Department of Education, the Office of the Solicitor General.
Solicitor General, yes.
I'm wondering why, what is this for? So again, I would re-emphasize, these agencies must justify their use of intelligence funds because of the nature through which these funds are accounted for, and that is through a sealed envelope system.
And yet, Senator, during the Senate debate on the OVP intelligence funds, some of your colleagues, some of them were your colleagues in the last Senate, they gave it a very fast green light, right? Without many questions asked. I wonder if you can give us some insight into what they might be thinking about.
I'm sorry, but I was not even there. What is on record is that the OVP has a 500 million intelligence and confidential funds. This is a new item in the budget, which was not there before. The DepEd has 150 million. Again, this is new, and the Office of the Solicitor General. What I want to emphasize is this must be carefully examined, because we have a tendency, if it is there, then we just allow it to continue. And that is what we have seen over the past years, because once it starts, it's already difficult to stop it.
Yeah.
And therefore,
so assuming that they follow your suggestion, that there's a sealed envelope that will be disclosed only, perhaps in an executive session of the Senate, and then the senators take a look at this, and then what? What can be done then?
Well, they can, in the budget cycle, they can reduce or remove totally the allocation for intelligence or confidential funds where they see abuse when the accounting is made in executive session, or where the very nature of the mandate, it does not really need confidential funds. The classic example is what you have mentioned, the Office of the Solicitor General. For her, I cannot understand. And the Department of Education must also justify their allocation of 500 million pesos for intelligence funds. So, to me, again, transparency requires that there be a public disclosure of what this is all about.
Yeah, Senator Drilon, when people hear confidential and intelligence funds, obviously two main concerns. One is, we get this idea that it's discretionary in effect, no? But how discretionary? That's the first question. And then the second question is the accountability at the end of this, the transparency and the accountability. We've been talking about transparency and accountability. I'm curious as well about how discretionary is this. So, halimbawa ako, binigyan ako ng confidential and intelligence funds. Let's say, for example, the Department of Education under the Office of the Vice President. What does that mean? Saan ko pwedeng gastusin so, and what are the kinds of expenses that are not, that should not be fair territory?
Well, there are certain guidelines on the expenses that can be justified. For example, purchase of information in pursuit of the relevant national security and peace and order problems, or rental of transport expenses, or maintenance of safe houses, purchase of supplies for confidential activities, payment of informers, and payment of funds of public money to prevent illegal activities that pose a clear and present danger to the agency personnel or property. There are stated uses, as I have enumerated, but as you can see also from the enumeration, it is very broad, broad enough to cover almost every activity.
Exactly. I mean, kasi yung tanong ko, how ridiculous can it get? Like, if, for example, I have intelligence funds, tapos sinabi ko kay Luchi, lunch naman tayo minsan, magkwentuhan lang tayo. Tapos, let's say, nagkwentuhan kami. Let's say, tinanong ko siya, kamusta ba ang media? Kamusta ba ang mga journalists? Nagkwentuhan lang kami. Diba? And then I say, ito, Luchi, I mean, pasalamat na ako sa'yo. Ito. And then, can I declare that as intelligence gathering, knowledge gathering? I mean, I know it's bizarre, I know it's ridiculous, but that's precisely my question. How ridiculous can it get with discretionary funds in our systems?
Theoretically, it can be abused. I have no proof that it is being abused, but given the wide discretion granted to the agency on the basis of the guidelines issued by COA, it is an issue. It is a fund that can be abused, as you have enumerated. But the thing is, it can be subject to scrutiny by COA and by Congress in exercise of its oversight functions. But I have not heard or experienced such scrutiny by COA, and probably what can be done is to call upon Congress to activate the Intelligence Oversight Committee. There is such an agency, an Intelligence Oversight Committee, which will now conduct executive sessions to examine how the 9.1 billion in confidential expenses and intelligence expenses were disbursed and used.
Yes, but is it
During
in the
the
interest
budget
of...
hearings, actually, si VP Duterte justified the confidential funds and intelligence funds for DepEd by saying that there's a direct link between basic education and national security. And then she cited, I recall, she cited the issue of sexual grooming of learners and youth recruitment to terrorism and drug use of DepEd workers. Do you think that these issues justify an intelligence or confidential fund?
These are policy issues, and that is why we have the oversight functions of Congress to look over the shoulders of the executive branch on how they disburse public funds. And there is COA, who is supposed to go over this and without making any public disclosure of how the funds were spent. They can disapprove certain expenses as not being proper, even if it's confidential, confidential or intelligence fund. COA can disapprove the particular accounting and require reimbursement from the agency.
Oh, but I mean, sir, I mean, in all reality, diba, the disapproval of the COA comes not only after the fact. Very often, it also comes many years after, and wala naman talagang pinapabalik na pera.
Well, Roby, yes, that's correct. It takes time to audit. A post-audit is what is the system. The other end of the scale, I don't think you'll favor a pre-audit system wherein the COA would give the go signal before the funds are dispersed. That will create a very difficult process. And therefore, to me, I'm in favor of a post-audit system because you have to make the government run. And you cannot let COA run the government by giving it authority to determine whether a particular disbursement is proper or not before it is disbursed. Now, the rule that this is not proper, appropriate action can be taken, including disallowance of these expenses.
Well, in fact, if you look at the 2021 intelligence funds that Congress granted President Duterte, it was pretty much used up, all of it, right? And we never got to see a full breakdown kasi nga it was confidential funds. And you correctly pointed out that the danger is palaki ng palaki once you start handing out confidential funds and it becomes a habit, right? What regulation, what laws do we need to put in place if we can at all to prevent this from happening?
It's a matter of regulation. It's a matter of properly enforcing this regulation through the audit of the funds, post-audit in an executive session, and for COA to exercise its prerogative to disallow certain expenses where they consider this as not proper.
But just to be clear, sir, even if you get to the point of a disallowance, how far does it actually go into ensuring accountability?
I'm not an accountant. I've never been with the Commission on Audit. But how far does it go? Well, the mandates are very clear. The mandates of the agencies are clearly defined. And if it is not consistent with the mandate, or it is not consistent with the rules on audit, then it will be disallowed. For example, you cannot pinpoint to any particular expense. You must look at it as it comes, or as it is as the public funds are audited, and the COA uses its judgment as to whether a particular expense can be justified.
Do you think this has something to do with the growing amounts also? Because I do recall that certain agencies would ask for intelligence or confidential funds, but they would be in the vicinity of, 5 million.
10 million.
But now, of course, we're talking about 500 million, 4.5. So it's grown also exponentially. So I guess my question is it just a matter of recalibrating so that the amounts are not as huge as they seem to be now?
No, I don't think that is the correct way of judging on the validity of the expense of public funds. It should be judged not by, we should be concerned from the first peso, whether it's 1 peso or 1 billion. These are public funds, and therefore, as I said at the start, there must be transparency in the use of public funds. The exception is in the case of confidential and intelligence funds, when you can account for this through a sealed envelope system. But therefore, it is very clear that it is not on the amounts, but on the manner in which the funds are disbursed. But of course, with such humongous amounts being placed in the budgets and the increases over the years, then inevitably public attention will be called, and correctly, public attention should focus on such expenses, because over the years it keeps on growing and growing and growing.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, Senator Drilon, if you don't mind, while you're here, we want to ask you also, not only as a former senator, but as a former Justice Secretary, we presume you've been following the developments with the Percy Lapid case. General Bantag, Secretary Remulla, the word war there. I won't ask about, the specifics of the case. I want to ask something about the Bureau of Corrections. How does it get to that point? People are shocked by cell phones, tapos masyashock kami na labas-pasok ang mga tao. Now we're looking at a ditch that's 200-meter wide na mukhang, with some pictures, it looks like pwedeng dumaan ng kotse doon kung magtuloy-tuloy yung tunnel kung saan man magpunta. But how does it get to that point that the Bureau of Corrections in Muntinlupa is basically its own republic, and you get the sense that republic is not necessarily being run even by the Bureau of Corrections. How did it get to this point?
But how did it get to this point?
Yeah.
If you look at it carefully, you start with the qualification of the appointed official. That's where it starts. If you appoint a guy like the present what's his name?
Gerald Bantag. Gerald Bantag.
Gerald Bantag, given his background, you should be expecting less than ideal management of the Bureau of Prisons. So it starts with the appointment of the head of the agency.
Okay.
Because you can have all the laws, you can have all the regulation. If it's made by man can break it.
Okay.
But to be sure, the Bucor, the Bilibid was already, Bilibid even before General Bantag took over. Sanay na nga ang media na nagko-cover ng mga SONA dyan, yung mga raids dyan, and then laging, they turn up all of these weapons and drugs and cell phones. It's been that way before General Bantag took over.
Way before. Let me venture a few items. Number one, that prison facility is congested, and therefore it is extremely difficult to manage. Number two, the present system and the present administrative setup, the Bureau of Corrections is only attached to the Department of Justice. The Secretary of Justice cannot reverse the decisions of the Bucor. So maybe I don't pretend to be qualified, but these are areas that can be looked into. But most critical is the appointing as the appointee, his qualification to head this very messy bureau. And we can look at the systems, and particularly the congestion there. I have been pushing, and I'm in favor of regionalizing this present prison system, because the aspect of reforming the persons deprived of liberty in our penal system is zero, not existing at all. There is no opportunity to reform because of the system and the congested facilities.
To that end, Senator, there's been many insinuations that this case goes higher up, right? It doesn't stop with, just Bucor or DOJ. Maraming, insinuations there. I might point out that Gerald Bantag is an appointee of former President Duterte. What did you think of all of that?
My training as a lawyer is just to look at the evidence. I don't want to speculate on that matter. At this point, the evidence points to the guy. And as I said, the rest are speculative at this point.
Okay.
Fair enough.
Fair enough. We'll have to leave it at that. Former Senator Franklin Drilon. Sir, maraming salamat po.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Good night.
And
Nice to have
that
you
is
again.
it for the Chiefs. We hope it was discussed. We'll keep the conversation going. Ako po si Roby Alampay.
I'm Luchi. Sorry. Sorry about that. Something wrong with the sequence.
Oo nga, minsan nag-iba-iba kasi yung sequence sometimes And I'm Regina Lay of One News.
I'm Luchi Cruz-Valdes of News 5.
We are One News, all sides, all the time.